Hello and welcome back to another episode of Math with Sohn. Today we are going to be solving using completing the square again, but it's going to be some of the harder problems. And the first thing that can make it completing the square a little bit harder is it's kind of obvious if the middle number is odd because we have to half that number. Okay, so we're going to do the exact same process, but we're going to be more upset because half of an odd number is a fraction. So the first thing, just like the other video, is to subtract the negative 3. You get x squared minus 7x equals negative 3. Now, I would argue that this is still easier than using the quadratic formula, which I'm going to be doing last in this YouTube series. Half of 7 is not that bad. It is way better to write this as 7 over 2, though. Half of 7, yes, is 3.5, but it will work out a lot better if you write it as 7 over 2. And on the other side, we still need to add that same technically negative 7 over 2 squared, but when you square a negative, it ends up being positive. So you got x minus 7 over 2 squared is equal to negative 3 plus square the top, square the bottom, 49, because 7 squared is 49, and 2 squared is 4. Now you have to add these two fractions together, which if you have a scientific calculator, it will do it for you. I'm looking around. Unfortunately, I don't have one, so I'm going to have to do these by hand. Negative 3, if we want to add that to 49, I would have to multiply by 4 over 4 to make the least common denominator. And if I do that, I end up with negative 12 over 4, which is just negative 3, added with 49 over 4. Okay, so x minus 7 over 2 squared equals... That part you get tired of writing. So I imagine at some point you're just going to be like ... because that gets annoying. Negative 12 plus 49 is 37 over 4. X minus 7 over 2 squared equals 37 over 4. And at this point you might be like tired of fractions. There's panic. It is okay because we're about to square root. And when we square root, yes, the fractions don't go away, but the problem does get a little bit better because we end up losing the square root and the squared, and we end up with the square root of 37 over the square root of 4. Well, the square root of 37 is the square root of 37, but the square root of 4 is just 2, and that is the main reason you definitely want to keep this as a fraction because all your answers are going to be in simplified radical form, but this, if you've done it correctly in the fraction form, will always square root on the bottom if you don't simplify, which is ironic. Don't simplify this fraction in advance, and this will work out where it will square root on the bottom of the fraction. If we have x minus 7 over 2, we have to add the 7 over 2 over. If we add the 7 over 2, we get 7 over 2 plus or minus the square root of 37 over 2. And that is how most of your answer choices will be written. I have seen a few of them because they're both technically over 2, put it over 2, but I would expect my students to keep it right there. All right? So that's version number 1. If this number is odd, it's just more annoying. There's another version if you have a leading coefficient. This is the main part of the video. 3x squared minus 12x plus 5 is equal to 0. Now here there are two different ways that you could go about doing it. The first thing you have to recognize is if there is a number in front, you absolutely cannot complete the square while it's there. So I personally would move the 5 over first, get 3x squared minus 12x equals negative 5. And then from here, you have to get rid of the 3. You have the choice of dividing everything by 3 or have the choice of factoring out the 3. Okay, so from here, you are perfectly allowed to divide by 3 and call it a day and just deal with that fraction. Or you can keep it like so. I'm going to do it both ways, and you can choose which way you think you would rather have. So here I've just factored out the 3, but I could have divided everything by 3 and ended up with negative 5 over 3. Here you get a fraction, here you don't get a fraction. So if we do it with the fraction, You take half of the 4, put it in parentheses squared, equals negative 5 over 3 plus that same negative 2 squared. And you end up with x minus 2 squared equals negative 5 over 3 plus 4. And then you have to add these two things by multiplying the negative 5 over 3 times 4 over, not 4 over 4, I'm an idiot. Multiplying the 4 times 3 over 3. And that would give you negative 5 over 3 plus 12 over 3. And you can combine those together and get 7 over 3 with the x minus 2 squared. Now, the big downside with this is when you square root this time, because we created the fraction, when you square root, you end up with x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 7 over the square root of 3, which you're not supposed to keep the square root on the bottom. But you can add the 2 over and get 2 plus or minus the square root of 7 over the square root of 3. And you would have to rationalize that square root of 3 on the bottom, which is really frustrating. Like, man, you got to now multiply by the square root of 3 and the square root of 3. It's turning into a big headache. I don't know if I'm a fan of the fraction method, but we'll see. 2 plus or minus the square root of 21 over, this would be the square root of 9, which is 3. Okay? So this version involves a fraction, but it is more straightforward. It's a fraction, it's annoying, but it's more straightforward, and it will normally involve this multiplying by the square root of 3 to get the rationalized denominator at the very end. If you choose to do it this way, you do not have to divide by 3. You still have to take half of 4, which is 2. And then on the other side, you still have to add that 3 times negative 2 squared. So that's the difference. If you've taken the number on the outside, you have to multiply by that 3 and then the negative 2 squared on this part as well. So we end up with 3x minus 2 squared equals negative 5 plus 3 times 2 squared is 3 times 4. 3 times 4 is 12. 3x minus 2 squared equals 7. Now what? Well, now we divide by 3. You still end up with a fraction, but it's at the end result. X minus 2 squared is equal to 7 over 3. Look familiar? 7 over 3. Square root both sides. X minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 7 over the square root of 3. You could write it as 2 separate square roots. Add the 2 over. And just like the other problem, you would have to multiply by the square root of 3 to get rid of this square root off the bottom of the fraction. So it'd be 2 plus or minus the square root of 21 over 3 when we do that, because if you multiply by the square root of 3 and the square root of 3, you get the square root of 9, which is 3. And the square root of 3 times 7 is 21. So you get the same result. You just have to choose which way do you like better. And it's kind of a toss-up. It's kind of a toss-up which way works better. But that is up for you to determine. I think that I'm going to have my students probably do the fraction method. That way we just get rid of it first. It's a little more annoying, but it's one less thing to remember. If you forget to multiply by 3 right here at that stage, then you're stuck in the water. So it's up to you, okay? The only thing that could be even harder than this is what happens if you divide by 3 and you end up with a fraction here. That would just be rude, which doesn't happen too much in Algebra 2. But it's the same process. Fractions are not your enemy. They're just a part of life. Okay? Till next time, stay positive, everybody. I will see y'all later.